Daniel Cobb had worked for the city's Department of Buildings for almost 12 years, and in that time he had been sent into every kind of basement, crawlspace, and forgotten utility room that Manhattan had to offer. Most of it was unglamorous work. Checking foundations, flagging code violations, writing reports that no one read until something went wrong. The call that brought him to the corner of a quiet block in Lower Manhattan that October morning seemed, at first, like more of the same. A building superintendent had reported a sinkhole forming in the sub-basement of an old commercial building, and Daniel's job was simply to assess it, photograph it, and recommend whatever repairs the city required before anyone got hurt. He took the freight elevator down with his flashlight, his clipboard, and a healthy amount of boredom, and found the sinkhole exactly where the superintendent had described it, a wide, ragged hole punched through the concrete floor, edges crumbling, darkness yawning below it where there should have been nothing but bedrock. He should have called it in immediately and waited for a structural team. Instead, kneeling at the edge of the hole, flashlight angled downward, Daniel saw something that made every instinct in him insist on looking closer. Not bedrock. Not pipes or old foundation work. A street. An actual paved street, faint and distant, lit by some dim source he could not identify, running away into the dark far below the basement floor he was kneeling on. He told himself it was an old subway tunnel, some forgotten extension abandoned decades ago. He was wrong about that, though it would take him most of the day to fully understand how wrong. Daniel called his supervisor first, the way protocol required, and got nothing but voicemail. He tried twice more before giving up and deciding, against every rule the department had ever drilled into him, to take a brief look before backup arrived. The hole was wide enough to lower himself through carefully, using an old service ladder bolted into the basement wall that he was fairly certain had not been on any inspection report he had ever filed for this building. He climbed down slowly, flashlight gripped tight, and found himself standing, several minutes later, on solid ground in a space that defied everything he understood about what should exist beneath a Manhattan office building. It was a street. A real street, cracked and old, lined with the crumbling facades of buildings that looked like they had been pulled directly out of an early 20th century photograph, gas lamp fixtures rusted but still standing at intervals, faint, sourceless light glowing pale gray overhead in place of any sky. Daniel stood there for a long moment, his flashlight beam swallowed almost entirely by the wider, ambient glow of the place, trying to reconcile what his eyes were telling him with anything he had ever learned in 12 years of city service. There were no city records of an underground district this size. No utility maps. No transit blueprints. Whatever this place was, it existed entirely outside the paperwork that was supposed to account for every inch of infrastructure beneath the 5 boroughs. He took out his phone to photograph it and found, predictably, no signal at all. He should have turned around right then and climbed back up the ladder. He did not. He walked the first street slowly, flashlight sweeping across storefronts with faded, peeling signage advertising businesses that had clearly not operated in decades, if they had ever operated at all. A barber shop, a grocer, a narrow building marked simply Hall, its windows boarded from the inside. The quiet unsettled him more than anything visibly threatening did. No rats. No drip of water. No distant rumble of subway traffic that should, by any reasonable geography, have been audible this close to the surface. He found a side street that opened into a wider square, dominated by the husk of an old fountain, dry and cracked, and it was there, crouched at the fountain's edge studying an old engraved plaque, that he first heard the sound. A low, wet clicking, coming from somewhere down one of the side streets, followed by something that might have been breathing, slow and deliberate, far too large to belong to anything small. Daniel straightened immediately, flashlight swinging toward the sound, and saw nothing but empty street and deep, unmoving shadow. "Hello," he called out, his voice cracking slightly despite his best effort to sound steady. "City Inspector. I am not here to cause any trouble." The clicking stopped. For a long, terrible moment, nothing in the underground city moved at all, and Daniel found himself holding his breath without meaning to, listening for any sign of what had been listening to him. Then, from the deep shadow of the side street, 2 pale eyes opened, low to the ground, far too wide set to belong to anything human, and Daniel understood, with a cold drop in his stomach, that he was no longer alone down here. He did not wait to see what stepped out of the shadow next. He turned and ran, flashlight beam jerking wildly across cracked pavement and rusted lampposts, his footsteps echoing far louder than they should have in the unnaturally still air. Behind him, he heard the clicking again, faster now, accompanied by a dragging, scraping sound that suggested something low and quick moving across the broken street in pursuit. He cut down a side alley without thinking, driven by pure animal instinct rather than any sense of direction, and nearly collided with a second pale shape emerging from a doorway ahead of him, tall and thin in a way no human body should have been able to bend. It hissed, low and wet, and Daniel threw himself sideways through a gap in a collapsed wall, scraping his arm raw against broken brick, and kept running, no longer certain which direction led back toward the ladder and the basement and the ordinary, sunlit world above. The streets twisted strangely the further he ran, narrow alleys opening unexpectedly into wide intersections, buildings that should have blocked his path simply not appearing where his sense of the city's layout insisted they should be. He risked a glance back once, lungs burning, and saw 3 of the pale shapes now, loping after him with a horrible, jointed efficiency, faces turned up toward him with mouths that opened far wider than any human jaw should allow. Daniel ran harder, deeper into the unfamiliar streets, and understood, somewhere beneath the pure animal panic driving his legs, that he had made a terrible, possibly fatal mistake coming down here without telling anyone exactly where he was going. He lost them, eventually, by ducking into the collapsed shell of an old apartment building and climbing 2 flights of crumbling stairs to a landing where the structure had partially caved in, blocking the path behind him with enough rubble that the clicking, dragging sounds finally faded into the wider silence of the underground streets. He sat there for a long time, back against a cracked wall, flashlight clutched in shaking hands, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. They had not looked like animals exactly, not in the simple sense of any creature he had ever encountered on an inspection. Something about their proportions, the way their limbs bent, the shape of their skulls beneath that pale, hairless skin, suggested a starting point that had once, a very long time ago, been recognizably human. He thought of old stories he had half dismissed over the years, rumors that occasionally drifted through city maintenance crews about forgotten subway levels, about people who lived below the official tunnels and avoided contact with anyone from the surface. He had always assumed those stories referred, at most, to a handful of unhoused people sheltering in disused stations. He was no longer certain that assumption had been correct. When his breathing finally steadied and his hands stopped shaking enough to be useful, Daniel checked his flashlight battery, found it at half charge, and began searching the wrecked landing for any way down that did not lead back toward the streets where those creatures had been hunting him. He needed a way out. He needed it quickly. And he was, by every measure he could think to take, completely and thoroughly lost. The building's lower floors proved impossible to navigate, blocked by collapsed stairwells and debris too unstable to climb safely, and Daniel eventually found himself forced back out onto the street level through a gap in a side wall, flashlight sweeping cautiously across an intersection he did not recognize from his earlier flight. The pale gray ambient light overhead had not changed at all, giving him no sense of how much time had actually passed, though his watch insisted nearly 2 hours had gone by since he first climbed down that service ladder. He moved carefully now, sticking close to building walls, pausing at every corner to listen before crossing into open intersections, the earlier panic settling into something more useful, a wary, deliberate caution built on 12 years of learning how to move safely through unstable structures. He found a faded street sign bolted to a lamp post, the lettering worn nearly smooth, and made out, with some effort, a name that meant absolutely nothing to him. Whatever district this was, it bore no resemblance to any street grid he knew from the surface, despite clearly occupying roughly the same footprint beneath it. A low sound reached him from somewhere behind, not quite the wet clicking from before, but something close enough to make his pulse spike immediately. He pressed himself into a doorway and waited, breath held, until the sound faded again into the unsettling quiet of the underground streets. He needed information. He needed a map, a landmark, anything that might tell him which direction led back toward the building he had originally descended from. What he found instead, rounding the next corner, was a faint flicker of actual firelight, warm and orange, coming from the broken windows of a building 3 blocks ahead. Daniel approached carefully, every instinct telling him that firelight in a place like this could mean either rescue or far greater danger, and he had no reliable way yet to know which. The building had once been some kind of meeting hall, judging by the wide doorway and the rows of collapsed benches visible through a gap in the boarded windows. Someone had cleared a space near the center of the floor and built a small, careful fire in what looked like an old metal trash barrel, the flames throwing long shadows across walls covered in faded, water-stained murals. He could see no one near the fire itself, though several makeshift shelters, blankets and scavenged furniture arranged into rough lean-tos lined the edges of the room. "Hello," he called out softly, standing in the doorway, flashlight lowered so as not to blind anyone who might be sleeping inside. "I do not mean any harm. I am lost, and I could use some help finding my way back to the surface." Silence answered him at first, the kind of careful silence that suggested people listening rather than people absent, and after a long moment a voice came back from somewhere in the shadows near the far wall, rough and wary. "Surface folks do not usually find their way down here on purpose," the voice said, "and the ones who find it by accident do not usually live long enough to go looking for help afterward." Daniel stepped further into the firelight, hands raised slightly, palms open. "I am not looking for anything down here except a way out. Something attacked me a few blocks back. Pale, fast, not entirely human-looking. I have been running from it for hours." A figure finally emerged from the shadows near the lean-tos, an older woman wrapped in several mismatched coats, her face lined and cautious in the firelight. "Then you have already met the locals," she said, "and it is a small miracle you are standing here telling us about it instead of feeding them." The woman introduced herself as Ruthie, and the small group that gradually emerged from the shadows around her, 6 people in total, watched Daniel with the careful, weighing attention of people who had survived a long time by being slow to trust strangers. "We have been down here longer than most," Ruthie said, settling onto an overturned crate near the fire and gesturing for Daniel to sit as well. "Started as a handful of folks looking for somewhere quiet to sleep that the surface had stopped offering us. Ended up learning, the hard way, that quiet down here comes with its own kind of rent." "The creatures," Daniel said. "What are they?" Ruthie exchanged a glance with a younger man standing near her, broad-shouldered, watchful, who Daniel would later learn went by the name Marcus. "Best guess, from what little anyone down here has ever pieced together," Ruthie said carefully, "is that they used to be people too. A long time ago. There are stories about a real district down here once, built and lived in properly, sealed off sometime way back when the city decided it was easier to forget about it than fix whatever went wrong in it." "Sealed off how?" Daniel asked. "Why?" "That," Ruthie said, "is the part nobody down here has ever gotten a straight answer to. But whatever happened, it did something to the people who got left behind when the doors closed. Generations of it, maybe. Enough time for whatever they used to be to wear away into whatever they are now." Daniel sat with that for a long moment, the warmth of the fire doing little to settle the cold that had crawled into his chest the moment he understood the implication. The creatures hunting him through these broken streets had not always been monsters. Once, a very long time ago, they had been people just like him. "How do you survive down here?" Daniel asked, watching the small fire crackle in its metal barrel. "If they hunt anyone who comes through?" "Carefully," Marcus said, speaking for the first time. "We keep to a handful of blocks they have mostly given up patrolling regular. Stay quiet. Do not go wandering into open intersections after the light shifts low, because that is when they hunt hardest. And we leave them things, sometimes, near the old boundary markers. Food, scraps, whatever keeps them satisfied enough not to come looking deeper into our territory. You feed them," Daniel said, something cold settling in his stomach at the implication. "We feed them enough to keep the peace," Ruthie corrected sharply. "There is a difference, and you would do well to understand it before you go judging people who have kept themselves alive down here a lot longer than your 12 years of city paperwork ever prepared you for." Daniel held up his hands, conceding the point. "I am not judging. I am trying to understand enough to get back to the surface alive." Ruthie studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. That, at least, we can help with. But it will not be quick, and it will not be easy, not with the light cycle where it currently sits. You will need to move when we tell you to move, and stay quiet when we tell you to stay quiet, or you will get all of us killed trying to save one careless inspector who never should have climbed down that ladder in the first place. I understand, Daniel said. You do not yet, Ruthie said. But you will before this night is done. They let him rest by the fire for what felt like an hour, though there was no reliable way to measure time accurately in a place where the ambient light never seemed to change. Ruthie explained, in pieces, what the small group had learned over years of careful observation. The underground district, as best they understood it, had been built sometime in the early part of the last century, an ambitious expansion project tied to early subway construction that had, for reasons no one down here had ever fully pieced together, been abandoned and sealed off rather than completed or demolished. Whatever population had been working or living in the unfinished district at the time of the sealing had simply been left behind, cut off from the surface, and forgotten by every official record that should have accounted for them. There used to be more of us trying to live down here, Marcus said quietly. Different groups, over the years. Most did not last. The ones who survived long-term learned the same lessons we did, mostly the hard way, or they did not survive to pass anything along at all. And no one on the surface knows about any of this, Daniel said. A few, Ruthie said. Workers who stumble down by accident, same as you. Most who make it back out get told, real quick, that nobody believes a word of it, and eventually they stop talking about it just to keep their jobs and their sanity. The ones who do not make it back out simply become one more name on a missing persons list nobody down here ever sees. Daniel thought of the sinkhole, the superintendent's casual report, the entire ordinary morning that had led him here, and understood, with a chill, exactly how easily he could have become one more forgotten name himself. A low sound rolled through the building, distant but unmistakable, the same wet clicking Daniel had heard hours earlier, and every member of Ruthie's group went still and silent at once, eyes flicking toward the boarded windows. Patrol, Marcus said quietly. Earlier than usual. They smell him, Ruthie said, nodding toward Daniel. Surface folks carry a scent down here that the locals do not forget easily, even hours later. We need to move him before this patrol decides to widen its circle. Move him where? Asked a thin, nervous-looking man Daniel had not yet been introduced to. The old transit platform, Ruthie said. 3 blocks east. If the maintenance shaft is still clear, that is the fastest route back up toward anything resembling the surface. Daniel rose immediately, every instinct telling him to trust the group's experience over his own exhausted, directionless sense of the streets outside. What can I do to help? Stay close, stay quiet, and do exactly what we tell you, Ruthie said, already moving toward the doorway with a confidence that suggested she had made this exact calculation many times before, for many different lost strangers, with varying results. And if anything goes wrong out there, you run for the platform without waiting for any of us. We know these streets. You do not. Daniel wanted to argue that point, some old instinct toward fairness rebelling against the idea of running while others stayed behind, but the clicking sound rolled through the building again, closer now, and Ruthie was already moving out the door into the pale gray light of the broken street beyond. He followed. They moved in a tight, careful group, Marcus at the front, Ruthie close behind Daniel, the others spread in a loose protective formation that suggested long practice at exactly this kind of movement. The streets here looked subtly different from the ones Daniel had fled through earlier, the buildings slightly better preserved, as though this section had seen more careful, deliberate use over the years rather than simple abandonment. This used to be a residential block, Ruthie murmured as they passed a row of narrow brick buildings, their windows dark but mostly intact. Before whatever happened down here happened. You can still see the old fixtures in some of the windows, if you look close enough. Daniel did not look closely. His attention stayed fixed on the shadows at the edges of every intersection, watching for the pale shapes that had hunted him so relentlessly only hours earlier. They were 3 blocks from the meeting hall when the first shape appeared, low and fast, cutting across an intersection ahead of them and vanishing into a side alley before anyone could react. Keep moving, Marcus said quietly, not slowing his pace. "It saw us. It will circle back with more before long. We need to be at the platform before that happens." "How much further?" Daniel asked, his pulse climbing again despite his best effort to stay calm. 2 blocks, Ruthie said. "If the layout has not shifted again." "Shifted," Daniel repeated. "The streets move." "Not exactly," Ruthie said, her voice tight with concentration as she scanned the buildings around them. "But something about how this place is built does not always sit still the way a normal street grid should. We have learned to read the signs that tell us when it has changed. Mostly." The king returned, closer this time, accompanied by a second sound that Daniel had not heard before, a low, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as though several of the creatures were communicating with each other across the broken streets. "They are coordinating," Marcus said grimly. "That is new. Or at least new to anything I have seen down here before." "New how?" Daniel asked. "Usually they hunt alone, or in pairs at most," Ruthie said, quickening the group's pace. "Coordinated tapping like that, spread across multiple blocks, suggests something is organizing them tonight that does not usually bother." The thin, nervous man from the meeting hall, whose name Daniel still had not learned, made a small frightened sound and pressed closer to the group center. "It is probably just him," Ruthie said, nodding toward Daniel without slowing down. "Surface sent this fresh probably has every one of them curious tonight, organized hunting or not." They turned a corner into a wide intersection, and Daniel saw, for the first time clearly in the pale ambient light, the old transit platform Ruthie had described, a long, curved structure with rusted railings and a faded sign overhead that read, in letters worn nearly to nothing, a station name he did not recognize. Beyond it, set into the curved wall, stood a heavy maintenance door, slightly ajar, dark passage visible beyond. "That is our way up," Ruthie said, relief evident in her voice for the first time since they had left the meeting hall. "Straight through that door, up the access shaft, and you should come out somewhere near the old freight terminal a few blocks from where you originally came down." The tapping sound rose suddenly, sharp and close, from every direction at once. They broke into a run without anyone needing to say the word, the entire group sprinting across the wide intersection toward the platform as pale shapes began emerging from alleys and doorways on every side, more of them than Daniel had seen in any single encounter so far, 6, then 8, moving with that same horrible jointed efficiency. Marcus reached the platform first and hauled himself up onto it, turning immediately to help the others climb after him. Ruthie shoved Daniel forward, and he scrambled up onto the cracked concrete just as the first creature reached the edge of the intersection behind them, its pale eyes fixed directly on him. "Door, now," Ruthie shouted, and the group surged toward the maintenance door together, the thin nervous man stumbling and nearly going down before Marcus caught his arm and dragged him forward. Daniel reached the door first and hauled it open the rest of the way, the rusted hinges screaming in protest, and held it as the others poured through into the dark passage beyond. He was the last one through, and as he turned to pull the door shut behind them, he saw, for one brief, horrible moment, a creature far closer than any of the others, close enough that he could make out, beneath the pale hairless skin and the wrongly jointed limbs, the unmistakable remnant of a human face, eyes wide and almost pleading in a way that did not match the predatory speed of its pursuit at all. Then the door slammed shut, and Marcus threw the heavy bolt across it, and the clicking and tapping outside dimmed into something distant and, for the moment, safely sealed away. The access shaft beyond the door climbed steeply upward in a tight, narrow spiral, old metal rungs bolted into curved concrete, and the group climbed in single file, breathing hard, no one speaking until they had put several full turns of the spiral between themselves and the sealed door below. "That was closer than usual," Marcus said finally, pausing to catch his breath on a narrow landing partway up. "Everything about tonight has been closer than usual," Ruthie said, her voice tight with an exhaustion that went beyond the simple physical effort of the climb. "I do not like how organized that hunt felt. I do not like it at all." Daniel, climbing just behind her, found himself thinking again about the face he had glimpsed in that last creature, the unmistakable, almost pleading humanity buried beneath everything else. "Ruthie," he said quietly, "do they remember? Whatever they used to be." Is there anything left of that in them at all? Ruthie did not answer immediately, continuing the climb in silence for several rungs before finally speaking. I think there has to be, she said. Some small, buried piece of it, anyway. I have seen things over the years that make me believe that, even when everything else about them says otherwise. But whatever is left down there, it is not enough to stop them hunting, and it is not enough to make that hunting any less dangerous for anyone caught in the way of it. That does not make it easier to think about, Daniel said. No, Ruthie agreed. It never has for any of us. They climbed the rest of the way mostly in silence, the weight of that thought settling over the whole group like another layer of the dark, close air around them. The shaft eventually leveled out into a narrow horizontal passage, dust thick on every surface, old pipes running along the ceiling in tangled, abandoned rows. Marcus led them through a series of turns that Daniel could never have navigated alone, each one chosen with the confident certainty of long, hard practice. How long have you been mapping this? Daniel asked, watching Marcus check a series of faint chalk marks scratched into the wall at each junction. Years, Marcus said simply. Every group that has tried to live down here has added a little more to what the last group figured out, assuming they survived long enough to pass it along. Ruthie's group is the longest-running one I know of. Most of what keeps us alive, she pieced together the hard way, over a lot of close calls that did not always end as well as tonight has so far. You make it sound like tonight is not over yet, Daniel said. It is not, Marcus said. Not until you are standing back on a real sidewalk under real sunlight, breathing real surface air. Down here, nothing counts as finished until it is finished. They reached a junction where the passage split 3 ways, and Marcus paused, studying the chalk marks with a frown that did not reassure Daniel at all. This is not right, he said quietly. These marks are not ours. Ruthie moved up beside him, studying the same marks with growing concern. Someone else has been through here. Recently, by the look of the chalk. Another group? Daniel asked. Maybe, Ruthie said. Or maybe something that learned how to make marks that look enough like ours to lead careless travelers somewhere they should not go. The group fell into a wary silence, studying the 3 branching passages with growing unease, the false chalk marks pointing confidently down the leftmost path while every other instinct in Ruthie's experienced group seemed to argue against trusting it. We take the center passage, Ruthie said finally. Slower route by my memory, but it avoids the open intersection where that thing back at the platform seemed to be coordinating its hunt. I would rather lose time than walk straight into whatever set those false marks up to look so convincing. Marcus nodded agreement, and the group moved forward into the center passage, narrower than the others, forcing them into a tighter single-file formation. They had gone perhaps 50 yards when the thin, nervous man at the rear of the group made a small, choked sound, and the whole group froze. Daniel turned, flashlight swinging back along the line, and saw the man standing rigid, staring at a side passage Daniel had not noticed branching off just behind them, his face drained of whatever color the dim ambient light usually left in it. In the side passage, barely visible in the gloom, stood one of the creatures, perfectly still, watching the group with an unhurried patience that felt far more unsettling than any of the earlier chases had been. It did not lunge. It did not click or tap or hiss. It simply raised one long, pale hand, fingers splayed, and pointed slowly, deliberately, back the way the group had come, toward the junction with the false chalk marks, as though offering a correction to a path it somehow understood they had been deceived about. No one moved for a long, frozen moment, the creature's raised hand still extended, its pale eyes fixed not on Daniel, but on Ruthie, with an attention that felt, impossibly, almost deliberate. It is pointing, the thin man whispered, his voice shaking. It is actually pointing. I see that, Ruthie said quietly, not taking her eyes off the creature. I have never seen one of them do anything like this before. Marcus's hand drifted toward the makeshift weapon, a length of pipe wrapped tightly with cloth at one end, that he had carried strapped across his back the entire journey. Could be a trick. Could be trying to hurt us somewhere worse than the false marks would have. Could be, Ruthie agreed. Or it could be exactly what it looks like. She studied the creature for a long moment, weighing something Daniel could not fully read in her expression, and finally spoke directly to it, her voice steady despite the obvious tension in her shoulders. "We are trying to get him back to the surface," she said, nodding toward Daniel. "Are you telling us the path ahead is wrong?" The creature did not answer in words, of course, but it lowered its hands slowly and turned and began moving away down the side passage at an unhurried pace entirely unlike the frantic hunting speed Daniel had witnessed earlier, glancing back once, as though checking whether they intended to follow. "I do not like this," Marcus muttered. "Neither do I," Ruthie said. "But I trust it less than I trust whoever set those false marks. Move quickly. Stay close." They followed the creature at a careful distance, weapons and flashlights ready, every member of the group tense and watchful as the passage wound through a series of turns that gradually grew more familiar to Marcus's experienced eye. "This connects back toward the old freight terminal," he said quietly, recognition easing some of the tightness in his voice. "I know this stretch. We are closer to a real way up than I realized." The creature paused at a final junction, where a faint draft of genuinely cold, fresh air drifted down from somewhere above, carrying with it the unmistakable, distant hum of real city traffic. It turned to face the group one last time, and for a brief, strange moment, its pale eyes settled directly on Daniel, holding his gaze with an intensity that did not feel predatory at all. Then it made a sound, low and broken, nothing like the wet clicking of the hunting calls, closer to a single, garbled syllable that might, with great difficulty, have once been a word. It sounded, Daniel would tell himself later, almost like the word go. The creature turned and disappeared back down the passage it had led them through, moving away into the dark without looking back again, and the group stood for a long moment in stunned silence before Ruthie finally broke it. "I do not know what that was," she said quietly, "but I think whatever is left of whoever that used to be, it just did something kind for a complete stranger. I have never seen that down here before tonight." "Maybe it remembers more than we thought," Daniel said. "Maybe," Ruthie said. "Let us hope it is not the only one." The draft of fresh air led them upward through a final stretch of narrow passage, the ambient gray light of the underground district giving way, gradually, to something warmer and more familiar, the dull orange glow of real sodium streetlights filtering down from somewhere above. They emerged, finally, through a rusted grate into the basement of an old freight terminal, water dripping somewhere in the dark, the sound of real city traffic now unmistakable, close and ordinary and almost overwhelming after the strange silence of the streets below. Daniel sagged against a support pillar, the full weight of exhaustion finally catching up to him now that the immediate danger had passed, and Ruthie's group spread out around him, equally drained, equally relieved. "This is as far as we go," Ruthie said, once everyone had caught their breath. "From here, you are close enough to find your own way up. A door at the top of these stairs lets out into an alley 2 blocks from where you probably started this whole mess." Daniel nodded, still catching his breath. "I do not know how to thank you for this. Any of you." "Do not thank us," Ruthie said, her voice firm and serious in a way that cut through the lingering relief in the room. "Thank us properly by listening to what I am about to tell you and meaning it." "I am listening," Daniel said. Ruthie studied him for a long moment, the firelight gone now, only the dim terminal light left to read her expression by, and what Daniel saw there was not gratitude or warmth, but something far more serious. "Do not come back down here," she said. "Not for your job. Not for curiosity. Not for any report your department thinks needs filing. Whatever you tell them about what happened today, leave this place out of it entirely and never set foot near that sinkhole again." "I do not think I could explain what happened down there even if I tried," Daniel admitted. "No report I file is going to mention any of this." "Good," Ruthie said. "Keep it that way. Every time word of this place gets out, even a little, it brings more curious people down those access points looking for answers, and most of them do not get lucky enough to run into someone willing to walk them back out." "What happens to you?" Daniel asked. "If more people start looking?" "We deal with it," Ruthie said simply. "The way we have always dealt with it. But it gets harder every time, and the locals down here do not take kindly to increased traffic through their streets, organized hunts like tonight or not. You being curious enough to climb down that ladder almost got 6 more people killed tonight on top of yourself. Think about that. The next time something tells you it would be interesting to go looking for answers down here. Daniel absorbed that quietly, the weight of it settling alongside everything else he had witnessed in the past several hours. I understand. I will not come back. And I will not send anyone else down here either, not from my department, not from anywhere. See that you do not, Marcus said, his voice carrying a weight that made the warning feel less like advice and more like a condition. Ruthie studied Daniel a moment longer, then nodded, apparently satisfied with what she found in his exhausted, sincere expression. Go on then. Get up those stairs, find your alley and go home. And maybe, if you have any sense left after today, find a different department to work for, one that keeps you somewhere a lot further away from sinkholes. Daniel climbed the final flight of stairs alone, the group staying behind in the terminal basement, watching him go without further ceremony. At the top, a heavy door, unlocked but stiff with disuse, opened out into a narrow alley exactly where Ruthie had promised it would, the cool night air and ordinary streetlight hitting him with a force that nearly buckled his knees with relief. He stood there for a long moment, breathing in real air, listening to the distant, comforting noise of actual city traffic, before finally making his way out of the alley and onto a street he recognized immediately, 2 blocks, just as promised, from the building where his entire ordeal had begun. His phone found signal again the moment he stepped onto the open sidewalk, buzzing with a dozen missed calls and messages from his supervisor, increasingly concerned as the hours had passed without any word from him. He called back immediately and found himself, for the first time since climbing down that service ladder, faced with the impossible task of explaining where he had been for the better part of a full day. He told a careful, partial version of the truth. A fall through unstable flooring. A long, difficult climb back to a safe exit. No mention of the underground streets, the pale creatures, or the small group of survivors who had walked him safely out of a place that, by every official record the city possessed, simply did not exist. His supervisor accepted the explanation with obvious relief that he was alive and unharmed, and scheduled, without much enthusiasm, a structural team to properly seal the sinkhole the following week. Daniel did not argue the timeline at all. He went home that night and slept for nearly 14 hours straight, his body finally allowing the exhaustion of the day to fully catch up with him once the adrenaline had completely drained away. When he woke, the entire experience felt, for one disorienting moment, like it might have been an unusually vivid dream. The scraped, healing wound on his arm, where he had cut himself scrambling through the collapsed wall during his first desperate run, told him otherwise. He returned to work 3 days later, citing a minor injury and a need for rest, and found the official report on the sinkhole already filed and closed, the structural team scheduled to seal it permanently within the week, exactly as his supervisor had promised. He did not request to be present for the sealing. He told himself it was simple professional distance, the kind any inspector might maintain from a routine repair job that no longer required his involvement. He knew, underneath that careful explanation, that it was something closer to fear, and a promise made to a woman named Ruthie in a terminal basement that he had every intention of keeping. For the next several weeks, he found himself avoiding that block entirely on his commute, taking a longer route that added 10 minutes to his walk simply to keep several streets of distance between himself and a building he no longer trusted, despite every assurance that the structural team had sealed the sinkhole completely and permanently. He told himself, eventually, that the avoidance would fade with time, the way most fears eventually did. It did not fade quickly, but it did, slowly, begin to settle into something more manageable, a quiet, private caution rather than the raw panic of those first few weeks. It was nearly 2 months later when Daniel saw Marcus again, entirely by accident, standing near a subway entrance several blocks from his own apartment, watching the evening commuter traffic with the same careful, observant stillness Daniel remembered from their long night underground. He almost walked past without acknowledging him, uncertain whether Marcus would want to be recognized in the ordinary daylight of the surface world, but Marcus caught his eye first, and gave a small, deliberate nod that Daniel understood immediately as an invitation to approach. "You look like you have been sleeping better," Marcus said, by way of greeting, Once Daniel had crossed over to him. Most nights, Daniel admitted. Some nights are harder than others. Marcus nodded, as though that answer satisfied some private expectation he had carried into the conversation. Ruthie wanted me to check on you, if I ever happened to see you up here. Make sure you kept your promise about not going back down. I have kept it, Daniel said. I have not gone anywhere near that block since the sealing crew finished their work. Good, Marcus said simply. That sinkhole was not the only way down, you know. There are others, scattered all over the city, if a person knows where to look and is foolish enough to go looking. I am not looking, Daniel said firmly. I have no intention of ever looking again. Marcus studied him for a long moment, the same weighing, careful attention Daniel remembered from their first meeting by the fire, and finally seemed satisfied with what he found in Daniel's sincere, exhausted certainty. Then we are square, Marcus said. And you can go on living up here, same as before, none the worse for it as long as that holds true. How is Ruthie? Daniel asked, before Marcus could turn to leave. And the others? Are you all doing all right down there? As all right as anyone manages, living the way we do, Marcus said. We move our camp every so often, when the locals get restless or a new patch of patrol activities starts looking risky. Ruthie still runs things the same careful way she always has. The kid who panicked at the false marks that night, he is doing better these days, getting steadier on his feet down there with every season that passes. Do you ever think about leaving? Daniel asked. Coming up here permanently, instead of just visiting. Something complicated crossed Marcus's expression at that question, gone before Daniel could fully read it. Some of us think about it more than others. It is not as simple as just walking up a staircase and staying there, though. Most of us ended up down there because the surface had already stopped offering us much of anything worth staying for. It is not glamorous, living the way we do, but it is ours, in a way very little up here ever managed to be. Daniel did not have a response for that, and Marcus did not seem to expect one, simply letting the honest weight of it settle between them for a quiet moment before nodding once, firmly, in a gesture that felt like a clear signal the conversation had reached its natural end. Take care of yourself, Inspector, Marcus said, already turning to head back toward whatever entrance had brought him up to the surface that evening. And remember what we told you. Whatever curiosity tries to talk you into someday, do not let it win. Daniel thought about that conversation for a long time afterward, turning it over in quiet moments at work, at home, on his careful, deliberately rerouted commute. There was something in the way Marcus had spoken about life below the streets, equal parts hardship and quiet, stubborn ownership, that stayed with him far longer than the simple fear that had dominated his memories of that night for the first several weeks. He found himself, against his own better judgment, beginning to research old city records during slow afternoons at the department, careful never to ask direct questions that might draw unwanted attention from his supervisors, simply piecing together fragments from public archives about early subway expansion projects, abandoned construction permits, sealed-off sections of infrastructure that had quietly disappeared from official maps sometime in the early part of the last century. He found enough to confirm, in broad outline, what Ruthie had told him that night by the fire. An ambitious underground district, begun with real intention, abandoned partway through construction for reasons the surviving records left frustratingly vague, sealed and forgotten by every subsequent generation of city planning that followed. He did not dig deeper than that. He told himself it was respect for the promise he had made, and that was certainly part of it. But underneath that careful justification sat something closer to simple, honest fear, a recognition that some questions, once answered fully, tended to demand action that he was not at all certain he was prepared to take. He closed the old records, filed them back where he had found them, and went home that evening resolved to leave the rest of the mystery exactly where it belonged, buried, sealed, and as forgotten as the city itself had clearly decided, decades ago, it should remain. Winter came, and with it the kind of bitter, biting cold that made every commute across the city feel like its own small ordeal, and Daniel found his thoughts drifting more than once toward Ruthie's group somewhere beneath the frozen streets, wondering how the cold reached down into those old, broken passages, and whether warmth was any easier to come by below than it was above. He began leaving small, careful donations at certain subway entrances around the city, blankets, warm clothing, non-perishable food, never with any note or explanation, simply left where anyone in genuine need might find them, surface dweller or otherwise. He told himself it was simple charity, the kind any decent person might practice during a hard winter, and in most respects that was entirely true. But some quiet part of him also understood it as a kind of ongoing thanks, offered in the only practical way he could think to offer it, to a group of strangers who had walked him safely out of a place that should, by every reasonable measure, have ended his life that day. He never saw Marcus again that winter, nor any sign that the donations reached the specific people he hoped they might. But he kept leaving them anyway, week after week, because it felt, in some small but genuine way, like keeping a promise that mattered, even if no one down there ever knew exactly who had been leaving them or why. Spring came eventually, the way it always did, and the bitter cold finally loosened its grip on the city, and Daniel found himself settling, gradually, into something that finally resembled his old life again, the night beneath the streets fading, slowly, into something closer to memory than active wound. It was nearly a full year after that first terrible night when Daniel finally allowed himself to walk past the original block again, the building where the sinkhole had opened now fully repaired, its basement floor solid and unremarkable, no trace remaining of the strange street and broken city that had once existed just beneath it. He stood across the street for a long moment, studying the ordinary brick facade, and felt, to his own quiet surprise, something closer to grief than fear settle over him, thinking of the pale, broken faces he had glimpsed in that desperate flight, of the small, deliberate kindness one of them had shown a complete stranger in a narrow passage far beneath the city's busy streets. He thought of Ruthie's careful warning, and of Marcus's honest, complicated answer about why so few of them ever truly wanted to leave, and understood, standing there on an ordinary spring afternoon, that the underground city and its strange, broken inhabitants would likely remain exactly where they had always been, forgotten by every official record, surviving in whatever fragile balance Ruthie's careful group had managed to maintain with them, regardless of whether Daniel Cobb ever thought about any of it again. He did not climb down any ladder that day. He did not seek out any further answers, or any further contact with the world he had so briefly, terrifyingly glimpsed. He simply stood there a while longer, paid his quiet respects to a memory that had shaped him more than almost anything else in 12 years of city service, and then turned and walked on, back toward the ordinary, sunlit streets of the only city he was now certain he ever wanted to belong to again. He requested a transfer not long after that, away from structural inspections entirely, into a quieter administrative role within the department that kept him firmly above ground, reviewing paperwork rather than crawling through basements and sub-levels for the rest of his career. His colleagues assumed, when they assumed anything at all, that the unexplained injury from the previous fall had simply left him more cautious than before, less eager for fieldwork, more content with a desk and a steady, predictable routine. Daniel let them believe whatever version of the story made the most sense to them. It was easier than the truth, and far less likely to end any future conversation with concerned looks and gentle suggestions that he speak to someone about what he had experienced. He kept the promise he had made to Ruthie faithfully, every single day, never once approaching another sinkhole, another sealed access point, another rumor of forgotten infrastructure beneath the city's endless, busy streets. He read occasionally brief news items about minor sinkholes or unexplained structural collapses elsewhere in the boroughs, and felt, every time, a small, private chill, wondering whether some other unlucky inspector might be standing at the edge of a similar hole that very same day, flashlight in hand, curiosity winning out over caution exactly the way his own had, once, very nearly fatally. He hoped, whenever those thoughts crossed his mind, that whoever found themselves down there might be lucky enough to stumble across a group like Ruthie's, willing to risk their own fragile safety to walk a frightened stranger back out into the light. He understood, better than almost anyone, exactly how rare and precious that kind of luck truly was. Daniel Cobb still lives in the city today, older now, settled comfortably into the quiet administrative life he chose for himself in the aftermath of that single, impossible night. He does not speak of it often, and when he does, only to the handful of people he trusts enough to risk the conversation, always careful to leave out the details that sound, even to his own ears all these years later, too strange and impossible for anyone reasonable to fully believe. He still leaves small donations at certain subway entrances each winter, a quiet, private habit that has long since become simply part of who he is, regardless of whether anyone below the streets ever benefits directly from any single one of them. He never went back down. He never broke the promise he made to a careful, weary woman named Ruthie in a meeting hall lit by a single small fire, and he never will, for as long as he is able to choose otherwise. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, standing near a subway grate and feeling the faint, warm draft of air rising up from somewhere far below the ordinary, busy streets of the city he loves, he finds himself wondering about the pale, broken faces he once glimpsed in that impossible underground district, about whatever small, buried piece of humanity might still remain in them after all these years, and about a single garbled word, almost certainly imagined, that once sent him safely on his way out of the dark. He does not know, and will likely never know, exactly what became of Ruthie's careful group, or the strange, broken city they have learned to survive within all these years. He only knows, with absolute certainty, that some doors, once closed, are meant to stay that way, and that the kindest thing left for anyone lucky enough to walk back out from beyond one of them is simply, faithfully, to never go looking for it again.